Greetings, I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and today, which is probably Australia Day, unless the date has been changed or you happen to be watching on a day other than January 26th, I've decided to build the most Australian tank that's ever existed, that being the AC1 Sentinel, the only tank designed and built by Australia, the one with that machine gun housing. As far as I know, no plastic kits of the Sentinel exist, so I've got the next best thing, a 3D printed kit. There's a link where I got this in the description. The files are for a 35th scale model, and at that size, the hull wouldn't fit on my build plate, not without being tilted vertically and taking a really long time to print, so I scaled it down to roughly 48th scale. The calculator I used said that should be 72.9%. Is that correct? I don't really know, but as long as the parts are all scaled the same, it doesn't really matter. I am pretty new to 3D printing, and this is the first time I've tried printing this kind of a model. I'm sure I could have got a better print with more tinkering, but I didn't really want to spend hours trying different things and reprinting with different settings and wasting resin. Most of the parts turned out pretty good on the first try. There are some lines here and there, and a bit of cleanup did have to be done, but for the most part, things have turned out pretty well. I did have to do a little bit of reprinting, but not so much as to be annoying. All of the parts are their own file, and there are something like 40 parts required, so I did have to spend a bit of time arranging them into 5 files with multiple parts. It would have obviously been kind of stupid to run the printer 40 times when it could be done more efficiently. Still, all of this probably took around 12 hours printing. As I said, there was a little bit of cleanup needed. The nubs from the supports can look a bit messy, but they're not too hard to remove. This is obviously resin, so plastic cement isn't going to be much use here. I've used this black flexible superglue from Icky Sticky, which is a great name for a company that sells glue. It works quite well, has a little bit of working time, and the black colour means you can see where you've applied it, though that does also make it look a bit messy. The first thing I did was to repair one of the lengths of track I broke. Here's a suggestion: don't drop your parts onto the floor.
Oh, that's some good advice.
It broke in such a way that it went back together nicely enough. It's just missing a guide horn. Surely nobody will notice that. I start the actual assembly with the turret, because why not? This stowage box goes on the back of the turret. It did take a bit of force to get the part into place, and I did actually trim the keying down because it was such a tight fit. I do wonder if scaling the model down could have been the reason for that. I follow that with the commander's cupola. There isn't really any keying here, it's shaped such that it should be pretty easy to see when it's in the right place. Also, probably be careful of that handle there, it is quite fragile. The mantlet is next, and this just clips into place, and I guess if you installed it without gluing it, you could elevate and depress it, but it would probably just flop around. I chose to glue it. And finally, the main gun. This goes into place nice and easy. All you've got to do is make sure that it's not at some weird angle. And that's the turret completed. I think it looks pretty good. Very turrety. Let's move on to the hull. The first thing I did was add the engine deck using a whole bunch of glue. I would suggest not mounting it quite so hard up against the part with the turret ring. Having it back a millimeter or two would probably allow the rear mesh parts to fit a bit better. As the youth say, hindsight is 20/20. Next, the hull machine gun with its not at all comical housing. There was a mounting pin on the back of this part, but I found I was unable to get the pin into the hole in the front of the hull, so I just cut it off and glued the part on over the hole. You'll probably notice that I managed to break the handles off the 2 forward hatches. I did this after very carefully removing the hull from the supports. How annoying. I didn't think it was really worth reprinting just for that though. Next, vision devices. These go into place nice and easily in the round mounts on either side of the machine gun. I'm sure these rotated, but I glued mine facing as directly forward as I could. On the rear, I add this set of spare track links. There isn't really anything to guide this, so I tried to get them as straight and central as I could. Now, the running gear. I began with the idler wheels. This is another part that didn't quite fit the recess intended for it. I did scrape and file the parts down a bit, but it still took a fair bit of pressure to get it where I wanted it. It made sense to add the bogies next. The fit with these is also kind of tight, but not quite as tight as the idler was. They will take a bit of nudging and kajiggering, but it is possible to get them on good and straight without any modification. I kind of suspect some of the tight fits have to do with scaling the model down. It could also be that the designer just didn't think about giving the parts enough clearance. Either way, I got the bogies on. They're not perfect, but the misalignment, particularly on the right side, is not overly conspicuous. I added the tracks next, and it was kind of hard to get the drive sprocket to mesh with the links. I had to apply quite a bit of pressure, and it felt like I might break something. I found it was a little bit easier to press the parts together before putting them onto the model. It was also kind of tricky to get the upper run of tracks into place with or without the drive sprockets on. There isn't really space to just slip it over the idler and return rollers, but you can kajigger it into place. I did it, so you can too. Just be gentle with it. The track didn't want to sit on the return rollers, which wouldn't look very good, so when I glued them, I used toothpicks as wedges to force the track down, without applying too much pressure. I also had to press the track against the idler. The bottom run of tracks goes into place a lot easier, especially if you start at the front. Making sure the sprocket teeth mesh with the tracks is probably the trickiest part of this. I did my best to make sure there wasn't too much of a gap where the track parts join, though they're not perfect. You can hide any gaps or missing guide horns with mud. After all, this is the most convincing place for error-concealing mud. The side stowage boxes come next. These are simple enough to glue on. That little ring that you'll definitely need to be careful not to break should face toward the rear. There is a little bit of back and forth play with these, so you might have to eyeball what you think is the right position. Now, the most annoying part to both print and install, the mesh panels. The mesh here is incredibly fine, and I really like them because of that, but that also makes them quite annoying to print in a way that you can remove the supports with no damage, and when they're off the supports, they're very delicate to handle. The front one isn't too difficult to place, and I think it's the best one to start with. The smallest one at the rear wouldn't go into place properly, and that's why I said earlier that it might be better if the engine deck was positioned a tiny bit further back, maybe a millimeter or so. I broke these small mesh parts on both sides, and the lower half of them is missing. They're not too prominent though, so I didn't worry about it too much. This rear side part, there's a notch in the forward edge that should go around the raised bit on the stowage box. You can see my mesh, especially on the front, has not escaped unscathed. I'd imagine this could be easily damaged on the real thing, so maybe that's not so bad. The largest piece of mesh goes on top of the stowage box, and angles upwards at the same angle as the top of the front piece of mesh. The part isn't quite long enough to reach all the way back to the rear piece of mesh, but I'm not sure how much of an issue that really is. If it is a problem, you could cover it with a tarp or something. I did manage to cause a bit of damage to the mesh for the right side of the hull, though I did fix it as best I could. This happened after I'd already had to reprint some parts, and I didn't want to set the printer up and then do cleanup just for one piece of mesh. I felt like it looked enough like battle damage that I just kept it that way. The rear stowage boxes come next. These have a fine bar on either end that I initially didn't realise the auto support function had put supports on, which caused them to break when I took them off the supports. I was a bit more careful when I reprinted them. This is one of the things I learned by doing. I'm capable of learning. Anyway, the little raised guides for these make them really easy to position. The left rear box had a chunk missing from the top of one of those bar support thingies, as you can see here. I replaced it with a bit of scrap, so if you look closely at it, it's probably a bit messy, but otherwise it's fine. You can also see that, at some point, I replaced the handles on the front hatches with some wire. I forgot to film it, but I'm sure you can imagine what bending 0.3mm wire and then gluing it into place might look like. The final detail is the towing cable, which I thought was going to be a huge pain to deal with. However, printing and removing it from the supports were almost a non-issue, though obviously it did have to be done carefully. Installation was pretty simple once I figured out where the cable should sit. One thing I like about this is that it kind of helps to hide how rough the mesh panel looks. Now it's time to use that locking tab mechanism to mount the turret. It fits quite well and isn't too tight. And that's it. The Australian AC1 Sentinel, 3D printed in roughly 48th scale from user Matt or Silver on cults3d.com, which I've linked below, is now completed. I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out. Could it be better? Yes, of course it could, but I'm still happy with it. It is one of my favourite tanks, and I think this is a pretty good representation. I would obviously prefer if there was a nice, highly detailed plastic kit available, but it's also really cool that this AC1 Sentinel sized gap in the market has been filled. This is, in my opinion, a fair bit better than the resin and metal gaming Sentinel that I built a few years ago, certainly a lot more detailed. I couldn't tell you how historically accurate its detailing is, but it looks the part to me, and it's a million times better than what I could achieve with my own 3D modelling skills. I did actually see a couple of free Sentinel files available, but this one looked to be the best. It did cost money, a little bit under 20 Australian dollary dues, so like €3 probably. At any rate, I'm happy to pay somebody for a skill that I don't have, and unlike a plastic kit, I can remake this as many times as I like. I don't really want to, but I could. There is obviously the cost of resin and alcohol for cleaning and such, but even then, it's still pretty good value. It does take a fair bit of time to print. I estimate the printing itself took about 12 hours, but that's not really time spent working on the model, unless for some reason you really like sitting there watching the printer plate go up and down. One thing I did notice, but didn't really care about at the time, was that the website does mention that a single-piece Sentinel file should also be included. I don't seem to have received that. It's not really an issue for me, but it is probably worth pointing out. The important thing to me is now I've got a pretty good looking model of an AC1 Sentinel. As an Aussie, it's kind of special to me because it's our own tank.
Be honest, Herbert.
It's because the whole machine gun is funny. Really though, it's an unusual and interesting vehicle, which is right up my alley. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. I didn't livestream this build, but I usually do, and if you want to join me and hang out while I build, you can do so over on Twitch, where I stream modelling at least twice a week. There's a link in the description. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing, share it with anybody you think might find it helpful, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi. Links for those are also in the description. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.